Just after midnight, the first reports began to break across southern Israel. A massive explosion rolled through the Negev desert, shaking windows, rattling walls, and sending emergency sirens screaming across nearby communities within minutes. At first, military officials believed it was another routine missile interception, the kind of tense but familiar incident the region has learned to endure. But seconds later, satellite sensors and air defense monitors revealed something far more alarming. Multiple high-speed ballistic objects were descending directly toward one of Israel's most heavily protected military installations. This was not a strike on a civilian town, not a random launch toward a border outpost, but a direct assault on the center of Israel's most advanced air power. In the darkness, the target came into focus: Nevatim Air Base. Deep in the desert, long regarded as one of the safest and most strategically important military sites in the country, the base suddenly found itself under what appeared to be a carefully planned and devastating attack. As the night sky lit up with fire and the first shockwaves rippled across the sand, confusion quickly gave way to fear. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the scale of what was unfolding suggested this was no ordinary exchange of fire, but the possible beginning of a far more dangerous regional escalation. Nevatim Air Base was not just another military installation on the map. Located deep in Israel's Negev desert, far from the crowded urban centers, and close enough to support rapid operations across the wider region, it had long been considered one of the country's most secure and strategically vital air bases. For years, it served as a central pillar of Israel's air superiority, housing some of the nation's most advanced aircraft, including its fleet of F-35 stealth fighters. These jets were designed for precision strikes, deep penetration missions, and rapid response operations against high-value targets far beyond Israel's borders. That is exactly why the attack that unfolded there felt so shocking. According to the early narrative surrounding the incident, the missiles were not aimed at civilians, border infrastructure, or symbolic public sites. They were directed at the operational heart of Israel's most advanced military aviation network. In other words, this was presented not as a random act of aggression, but as a calculated strike against one of the most important pieces of Israel's defense architecture. The timing of the attack made the situation even more disturbing. It reportedly came during the late night hours, when personnel movements inside the base were shifting between rotations and many service members were either in barracks, command areas, or support facilities. That detail matters because it helps explain why the strike, as described, was said to have caused such immediate chaos. Within moments of the first impacts, the base was portrayed as being engulfed in secondary explosions, fire, and confusion. Fuel storage areas were allegedly hit first, followed by damage to aircraft shelters, operational buildings, and military living quarters. Emergency responders, medical teams, and military convoys reportedly rushed toward the scene as local hospitals were placed on high alert. The broader context presented in the content suggests that this was not merely a tactical strike, but a deliberate attempt to challenge Israel's image of strategic invulnerability. Nevatim had been seen as heavily defended, shielded by multiple layers of air defense and advanced surveillance systems. So the very fact that it could be hit at all became part of the story's central drama, transforming the event from a battlefield incident into a potential turning point with wider regional implications. Nevatim Air Base occupies a unique place in Israel's military strategy because it is far more than a normal airfield. In the broader defense structure, Nevatim represents a central hub of long-range air power, rapid strike capability, and technological superiority. Its location in the Negev desert gives it both strategic depth and operational flexibility, allowing aircraft to launch from a relatively protected position while still reaching key areas across the Middle East. That matters because Israel's security doctrine has long depended on the ability to respond quickly, strike precisely, and project force well beyond its immediate borders. In that framework, Nevatim is not simply a base that stores planes. It functions as one of the foundations of Israel's deterrence posture, a place from which some of its most sensitive and strategically valuable missions can begin. Any threat to Nevatim, therefore, is automatically seen as a threat not just to one installation, but to the larger structure of Israeli military confidence and regional reach. At the center of that importance is the F-35 fleet. These stealth fighters are among the most advanced combat aircraft ever fielded, and in Israel's case they are often described as one of the crown jewels of its air force. Their value lies not only in speed, maneuverability, and firepower, but also in their ability to operate in highly contested environments where older aircraft would face much greater risk. The F-35 is built for deep strike missions, intelligence gathering, precision targeting, and penetration of sophisticated air defense networks. In practical terms, that means these aircraft give Israel the option to reach strategic targets far beyond its borders while reducing exposure to enemy radar and interception systems. For years, that capability has been viewed as one of Israel's strongest deterrents against regional adversaries, especially Iran. The mere presence of these jets at Nevatim sends a message that Israel can detect, track, and if necessary hit high-value military targets at long range with extraordinary precision. That is why Nevatim carries such symbolic weight. A strike on this base is not interpreted as an ordinary military incident. It is understood as an attack on the nerve center of Israel's most advanced air warfare capability. If aircraft shelters, maintenance zones, or operational sections connected to the F-35 fleet were truly damaged, the consequences would go beyond the immediate physical destruction. Such a blow would raise serious questions about the survivability of Israel's premier military assets, the reliability of its layered defenses, and the assumption that its most prized systems can remain protected during a large-scale confrontation. In strategic terms, targeting Nevatim means targeting Israel's confidence in its own technological edge. It challenges the idea that its most sophisticated weapons can always remain one step ahead of regional threats. That is exactly why the base matters so much, and why any attack connected to it would immediately be seen as a potential turning point with consequences far beyond the runway. What happened over Nevatim that night unfolded with terrifying speed. According to the scenario presented in the content, the first warning signs appeared only moments before impact. Military radar operators initially believed they were tracking another routine missile event, the kind that Israel's layered defense network is specifically built to handle. But within seconds, the incoming picture began to look far more dangerous. Multiple high-speed ballistic objects were detected descending toward the base from different directions, creating a compressed decision window for the defenders. Instead of facing a single threat vector, radar crews were suddenly forced to track several fast-moving targets at once, some appearing to follow higher ballistic arcs, while others seemed to approach on flatter, less predictable paths. This kind of coordinated pattern would have placed extraordinary pressure on even a highly advanced missile defense system, forcing interceptors, sensors, and command crews to divide their attention in real time. As the missiles closed in, the atmosphere inside and around Nevatim reportedly shifted from alert to chaos. Sirens wailed across the installation, emergency communications channels lit up, and personnel rushed toward shelters and protected positions. Yet, the speed of the incoming strike appears to have left little room for a full defensive response. The content suggests that at least several missiles managed to slip through the protective shield surrounding the base. Whether because of saturation, timing, trajectory, or the sheer pace of the attack, the result was the same. The defensive envelope was breached. Seconds later, the first impact reportedly struck one of the most dangerous and vulnerable targets on the installation, a fuel storage area. That first explosion did not remain isolated. It ignited a chain reaction. A massive fireball rose into the desert sky, and the shockwave rolled outward across the runways, operational zones, and residential sections of the base. And the fact that the target was such a strategically important airbase combine to create an event with enormous emotional and political weight. A strike of this kind would not only represent a physical loss, it would also strike at national confidence, military credibility, and the long-standing belief that Israel's most critical defense assets remain protected under even extreme threat. If the casualty figures and infrastructure damage were ever fully confirmed, the event would likely be remembered not just as another escalation, but as one of the most severe single attacks ever directed at a major Israeli military installation. One of the most important questions raised by the strike on Nevatim is how such a heavily defended base could have been penetrated at all. Israel's air defense architecture is widely regarded as one of the most advanced in the world, built around multiple layers designed to detect, track, and intercept different kinds of threats at different ranges and altitudes. In theory, that kind of system should make it extremely difficult for hostile missiles to reach a target as important as Nevatim. But even the strongest defensive shield can be tested under the right conditions, especially if the attack is designed not around one powerful blow, but around complexity, speed, and overload. The scenario described in the content strongly suggests that the attackers did not rely on a simple, linear missile strike. Instead, they appear to have used a coordinated method intended to pressure the entire defense network at once, forcing radar operators, interceptors, and command systems to manage too many threats in too little time. A key element of that method is the idea of launching missiles from multiple directions simultaneously. If incoming threats approach from only one corridor, defenders can concentrate radar coverage, cue interceptors more efficiently, and build a more focused response. But when missiles arrive from different azimuths at nearly the same time, the defensive system has to divide its attention. Radar operators must track several inbound objects at once, command crews must prioritize which ones appear most dangerous, and interceptor batteries must respond under extreme time pressure. This is where the concept of a saturation attack becomes critical. In military terms, a saturation attack is not simply about firing a large number of missiles. It is about presenting so many simultaneous problems that the defender's system begins to lose efficiency. Even a highly advanced defense can become strained when it has to identify, classify, assign, and engage multiple fast-moving threats at once. If only a few missiles slip through that process, the outcome can still be devastating. The reported use of mixed trajectories adds another layer to the problem. Some of the incoming missiles were described as following higher ballistic arcs, while others appeared to travel along lower, flatter paths. That difference matters because radar and missile defense systems calculate threats partly based on expected flight behavior. When incoming weapons do not all follow the same pattern, the defensive network is forced to process a more complicated picture. High-arc ballistic tracks may draw attention upward and outward, while lower and faster approaches can compress warning time and create uncertainty about the true order of danger. In other words, the attack may have been designed not only to overwhelm the system numerically, but also to confuse it geometrically. Different flight profiles force the defense network to split its focus between separate interception envelopes, increasing the chance that one or more missiles reach the target area. Speed is another major factor. Advanced ballistic missiles can travel at extremely high velocities, which dramatically reduces the time available for detection and response. If radar systems pick up an incoming missile only seconds before impact, even a well-trained and technologically advanced crew may have almost no margin for error. That short reaction window becomes even more dangerous when several missiles are arriving at once. Operators must make rapid judgments, command chains must work flawlessly, and interceptors must be launched and guided under intense pressure. In that kind of compressed timeline, the defense does not need to fail completely for damage to occur. It only needs to fall slightly behind the pace of the attack. That is why the content frames the strike not as a mystery of total defensive collapse, but as the result of an attack engineered to exploit the natural limits of even a very strong missile shield. Taken together, these factors help explain why the strike feels so plausible within the logic of the narrative. A multi-directional launch pattern, mixed flight paths, very high missile speed, and a saturation-style concept would all work toward the same objective: overload radar, shorten reaction time, and complicate intercept. Interceptors must be launched and guided under intense pressure. In that kind of compressed timeline, the defense does not need to fail completely for damage to occur. It only needs to fall slightly behind the pace of the attack. That is why the content frames the strike not as a mystery of total defensive collapse, but as the result of an attack engineered to exploit the natural limits of even a very strong missile shield. Taken together, these factors help explain why the strike feels so plausible within the logic of the narrative. A multi-directional launch pattern, mixed flight paths, very high missile speed, and a saturation-style concept would all work toward the same objective: overload radar, shorten reaction time, and complicate interception decisions. This gives the story analytical weight. It suggests that Nevatim was not breached because its defenses were weak in general, but because the attackers may have crafted a method specifically designed to break through a layered and sophisticated system. That distinction matters because it turns the event into more than a dramatic battlefield episode. It makes it a case study in how modern missile warfare can challenge even the most advanced defensive networks when speed, coordination, and tactical design are combined effectively. If the missiles that struck Nevatim were truly launched directly from Iranian territory, then the meaning of the attack changes completely. It would no longer be viewed as another episode in the long pattern of indirect confrontation that has defined much of the Israel-Iran conflict over the years. For decades, much of the tension between the two countries has played out through shadow warfare, covert actions, cyber operations, proxy forces, and deniable attacks carried out through regional partners. That ambiguity has often allowed both sides to signal strength without crossing the line into open state-on-state war. But a direct launch from inside Iran would strip away much of that ambiguity. It would move the confrontation out of the shadows and into a far more dangerous and visible phase, one in which two sovereign states are no longer trading pressure through intermediaries, but striking each other directly with strategic weapons. That distinction is politically and militarily enormous. A proxy attack, even a serious one, leaves room for interpretation, delay, and controlled retaliation. Leaders can debate attribution, weigh the risks of escalation, and sometimes choose responses designed to preserve deterrence without triggering a wider war. But a direct attack from Iranian soil would create a very different kind of pressure. It would present Israeli leaders with a far more public and immediate challenge to their credibility, because the strike would not merely reflect hostility from an aligned militia or regional partner. It would signal that Iran itself was willing to openly test Israel's military defenses and strategic red lines. In that scenario, the pressure to respond decisively would rise sharply, not only because of the damage inflicted, but because failing to answer a direct state attack could be interpreted across the region as weakness. For a country like Israel, whose deterrence posture depends heavily on the belief that major strikes will be met with force, that perception carries major consequences. From Iran's perspective, if the launch truly came from its own territory, it would also represent a dramatic statement of confidence in its missile capabilities and a willingness to accept much higher escalation risks. It would suggest that Tehran was no longer relying only on proxies, deniability, or limited pressure tactics, but was instead prepared to demonstrate its reach in unmistakable terms. That would change strategic calculations not just in Jerusalem and Tehran, but in Washington, Gulf capitals, and military command centers across the region. A direct Iranian strike on one of Israel's most important air bases would signal that the rules of engagement may have shifted. It would imply that this is no longer a contest of hidden blows and unofficial warnings, but the possible beginning of direct interstate confrontation. That is why this point functions as the turning point of the story. If the missiles came from Iran itself, then the crisis stops being a dramatic military incident and becomes something much more dangerous. A threshold moment that could redefine the conflict and push the region toward open war. The strategic and psychological impact of a strike on Nevatim would extend far beyond the physical damage left behind on the runways, shelters, and operational buildings. What makes such an attack so consequential is not only what it destroys, but what it challenges. Nevatim is more than a military base. In Israeli strategic thinking, it stands as a symbol of technological superiority, long-range reach, and the belief that the country's most valuable military assets remain protected even. That is why a successful strike on this installation would carry meaning far beyond the immediate battlefield. It would send a message that one of Israel's most heavily defended and symbolically important targets can, under the right conditions, still be reached. And once that message is seen by military planners, rival governments, and regional observers, the psychological effect begins to spread. At the center of that effect is the role of the F-35 fleet. These aircraft are not just advanced fighter jets. They are widely viewed as a core pillar of Israel's deterrence posture. They represent the ability to strike at long distance, penetrate hostile defenses, and maintain a decisive qualitative edge over potential adversaries. In strategic terms, they are part of the backbone of Israel's credibility. If a base associated so closely with that capability is hit, then the damage is not measured only in burned infrastructure or lost equipment. It is measured in shaken assumptions. Military leaders would be forced to reconsider how secure their most critical assets really are. Policymakers would face pressure to restore deterrence quickly. The public, meanwhile, would be confronted with an image that cuts deeply against years of confidence. The idea that even the most protected symbols of national strength may no longer be untouchable. That is what gives the event its broader regional significance. When a place like Nevatim is struck, the meaning is understood far beyond Israel's borders. Allies begin asking harder questions about vulnerability, response, and escalation. Adversaries begin studying what the attack might reveal about defensive limits. In that sense, the blow lands twice, once on the target itself and again on perception. The first impact is military, the second is strategic. If Nevatim is seen as a symbol and the F-35 force as the spine of Israeli air deterrence, then hitting that symbol changes how the entire region reads Israeli power. Even if the military damage can eventually be repaired, the psychological shock may linger much longer, because once an untouchable target has been touched, every future calculation is made in a different atmosphere. Israel's response in the immediate aftermath of the strike was defined by urgency, shock, and a rapid shift from crisis management to preparation for possible retaliation. Within minutes of the explosions at Nevatim, emergency communication channels between the Air Force command structure and Israel's national security leadership were reportedly activated at the highest level. Senior commanders were said to have moved quickly into protected control rooms as radar data, damage assessments, and field reports began pouring in. Across the country, air defense units were placed on maximum alert, additional interceptor batteries were activated, surveillance systems intensified their monitoring, and military planners prepared for the possibility that the strike on Nevatim might only be the opening phase of a wider attack. The immediate priority was clear: contain the damage, prevent a second surprise strike, and establish a national defensive posture strong enough to absorb whatever might come next. At the base itself, the response was equally intense. Fire crews, rescue teams, medical helicopters, and military convoys reportedly flooded the area as parts of the installation were still burning. Sections of the base were sealed off to control movement, secure damage zones, and protect sensitive military infrastructure. Wounded personnel were evacuated under emergency conditions while engineers and explosive ordnance teams began searching for unexploded debris and missile fragments scattered across the site. Recovering those fragments was not simply a cleanup task, it was part of a larger intelligence effort. Every component, from guidance systems to propulsion fragments, could help reveal what type of missile had been used, where it came from, and how it managed to penetrate one of Israel's most heavily defended military installations. At the same time, reconnaissance drones were reportedly launched to trace possible launch corridors, while analysts reviewed radar tracks second by second in an effort to identify the exact origin of the attack. Beyond the immediate rescue and investigation, the broader military posture of Israel appears to have shifted into a wartime mindset. Fighter aircraft from other bases were reportedly kept in the air or placed on rapid launch status, ensuring that the country's air arm remained ready both for defense and for a possible retaliatory mission. Air defense systems across Israel stayed fully active, with radar operators scanning every potential threat corridor. But even as the military focused on protection, the political and strategic pressure to respond began building rapidly. A strike of this magnitude against a base like Nevatim could not be treated as a routine incident. It demanded not only recovery, but a visible restoration of deterrence. That is what makes this phase so important in the story. It marks the transition from being hit to preparing to answer. Israel is no longer presented simply as a target under attack, but as a state moving quickly to stabilize the battlefield, gather evidence, harden its defenses, and weigh the form, timing, and scale of a response that could reshape the entire region. The reaction from the United States and the wider international community would almost certainly be immediate and intense. Washington would be expected to monitor the situation closely from the first moments after the strike, especially given the strategic importance of Nevatim and the long-standing military partnership between the United States and Israel. American intelligence agencies would likely begin reviewing satellite imagery, radar tracking data, and communications intercepts in an effort to determine exactly how the attack was carried out, where the missiles were launched from, and whether additional strikes might follow. At the same time, senior U.S. defense and diplomatic officials would almost certainly be in direct contact with their Israeli counterparts, coordinating assessments and discussing possible next steps. This kind of consultation matters because any major escalation involving Israel and Iran immediately raises the possibility of a wider regional crisis that could affect U.S. forces, allies, and strategic interests across the Middle East. Beyond Washington, diplomatic channels across multiple capitals would likely become active within hours. Governments in Europe, the Gulf, and other major power centers would be watching closely, trying to understand whether this was a single dramatic incident or the opening phase of a much larger confrontation. The main fear would not only be the strike itself, but the chain reaction that could follow. If Israel responds forcefully and Iran answers in return, the conflict could quickly spread beyond a single air base or a limited military exchange. Shipping routes, energy markets, regional alliances, and neighboring states could all be pulled into the crisis. That is why this part of the story matters. It expands the meaning of the attack beyond Israel alone and places it inside a much larger geopolitical frame. What happens next would not just shape Israeli security, it could alter the balance of power across the Middle East and push the region dangerously close to a broader war. As dawn slowly approached over the Negev desert, the full meaning of what had happened at Nevatim was still unfolding. What began as a violent series of explosions in the dark now appeared to be something far more significant, a strike that may have shattered long-held assumptions about security, deterrence, and military vulnerability in the region. If the scale of the damage and casualties described in the story is even close to accurate, then this was not just another exchange in a familiar cycle of tension. It may have been a turning point, the kind of event that forces every government, military planner, and regional rival to rethink what comes next. And that is the question now hanging over the entire Middle East. How far will Israel go in response? Will the retaliation be limited, calculated, and contained, or will it expand into a much broader confrontation that neither side can easily control? Because once major military assets are hit and national prestige is on the line, the pressure to answer can become overwhelming. For now, the smoke has not fully cleared, the facts are still developing, and the next move has not yet been made, but the tension remains unmistakable. This story is not over. It feels like the opening chapter of something larger, more dangerous, and potentially far more difficult to stop once it begins.